Dark clouds roll across the sky over a torn battlefield. The air smells of smoke and iron soldiers sit restless. Their uniforms torn, their faces weary, whispers spread among them of a man who came from nowhere. A preacher dressed in black holding a Bible worn by time. He spoke with a voice that carried through the camp like thunder, yet calm, like a prayer. He gave a final sermon, one that stirred hearts and brought tears to hardened men. Every word felt heavy, as if carved into their souls. When morning came, the pulpit stood empty, the Bible still open, but the preacher was gone. No footsteps, no trail, only silence and questions. Who was this phantom preacher and why did he never return? The year is 1863. The Civil War is raging like a storm that refuses to rest. The sound of cannons echoes across valleys. The sky burns red with fire and smoke. Towns once alive with children and laughter now lie in ruins. The air is heavy with ash. Families scatter in fear, their homes swallowed by flames and their fields trampled beneath boots of men who march for causes greater than themselves. Faith is one of the few things keeping these soldiers alive in the middle of blood and chaos. They cling to the words of Scripture like a lifeline. A single verse can hold back despair. A whispered prayer can give strength where no strength remains. Many young men, barely more than boys, press crosses to their chests before battle. Somewhere scraps of cloth with passages sewn into them, believing the words will shield them from bullets. Others kneel in mud before the march, whispering to a God they hope is listening. In every camp, the atmosphere is the same, the stench of smoke mixed with sweat and blood, the distant cries of the wounded filling the night, the weary songs of men trying to remember home when darkness falls. The campfires glow like scattered stars across the broken land. Men huddle together, some writing letters that may never reach loved ones. Others staring silently into the flames, wondering if they will see another sunrise. Faith is all they have, faith, and the bond of the brother beside them. But faith is fragile. War shatters it with every musket shot and cannon blast. For every soldier who clings to God, there is another who curses him. For every prayer whispered, another man spits at the sky. Soldiers bury their friends in shallow graves and ask, why? Why did God not spare them? Why does the killing never end? Townsfolk, too, are divided, churches split apart. Preachers either rally men to fight in the name of righteousness or beg for peace that never comes. In this darkness, belief itself becomes a battlefield. Still, there are moments of quiet in the storm when soldiers find a hymn rising unbidden from their lips. Soft voices joining until the whole camp seems to tremble with a sound, not of war but of something greater. For a brief moment, they are not killers or victims, but men searching for hope. Each note carries into the night like a fragile promise, and in those fragile promises, faith survives. Rumors spread across the lines of strange figures appearing in battle, men who seem more spirit than flesh. Stories grow of ghostly horsemen, of angels standing guard over soldiers, of preachers who come and go, as if the earth itself sends them to speak. These stories bring comfort to some, terror to others. Soldiers who have lost everything cling to such tales because they need to believe that heaven still watches, even here in the mud and blood of America, torn in two. In the southern towns, faith takes a different form. Mothers pray by candlelight for sons they may never see again. Wives read psalms aloud to empty rooms, their voices breaking on words of mercy. Children repeat prayers taught to them by trembling elders. All the while, smoke from burned farms drifts into the night sky, carrying with it the memories of lives once simple, once peaceful, now gone forever. Faith is not just belief here, it is survival. Without it, despair would swallow every soul. The northern camps are no different. The same songs, the same prayers. Men march with verses etched into their minds, repeating them with every step they march to drown out fear. They march to silence the image of friends lying still in the mud. They march because if they stop to think, the weight of it all might crush them. Like stone, faith is the thread that ties them to home, the invisible chain that binds them to something beyond this endless war. Everywhere the land bears the scars of conflict, burned fields, shattered churches, abandoned schools, silence where once life thrived. And yet in that silence there is a strange power. When night falls and the world seems emptied of hope, the smallest candle glows brighter. Men whisper to each other that God has not forgotten them. Though they do not know why they believe, they continue to believe, because without belief, the war would devour what little humanity remains in these desperate years. Faith becomes more than religion. It becomes memory. It becomes longing for peace, for family, for the comfort of a hand held across a table. It becomes a reason to rise when all else urges men to lie down and let death take them. Even the skeptic, even the man who curses the sky, will sometimes find himself whispering to it when the darkness grows too heavy and the loneliness too sharp. Faith haunts them all, whether they seek it or not. This is the stage of America in 1863, a nation torn apart. A people drowning in grief and fear, yet clinging to scraps of belief like sailors lost at sea, clutching pieces of a broken ship. The war rages, towns burn, but faith holds its fragile place within shattered hearts, and in this storm of fire and sorrow, whispers grow, whispers of a man, a preacher who comes from nowhere with words not of this earth, a phantom who speaks once and vanishes, leaving men shaken to their souls. Who is he? What does he want? And why does his voice sound like it carries the weight of eternity? The night was heavy in Virginia. The camp was quiet except for the crackle of fires and the distant thunder of cannons. Somewhere beyond the hills, soldiers lay restless, some whispering prayers, others too tired to speak at all. The air was damp, the smell of gunpowder still clinging to the wind, when suddenly, without warning, a figure appeared at the edge of the camp. He did not come with a wagon or a company of men. There were no footsteps to announce him, no voice to call. His name one moment. The camp was empty the next. He was simply there. He wore a long coat of black cloth, weathered and frayed as if it had seen storms across many years. His hat was pulled low, casting shadows across his face, though the flicker of firelight revealed eyes that seemed both kind and unyielding. His hands held a Bible so old its leather cover was cracked and torn, its pages worn thin as though read 1,000 times by 1,000 hands. It looked as if it might fall apart with the touch of the wind, yet he held it like treasure. The soldiers noticed him slowly, some turning their heads from the fire, others blinking in disbelief. One whispered that he had not walked into camp. He had just appeared. Another swore he had seen the man come out of the smoke itself, drifting between tents like a shadow. The whispers grew louder until the entire company was aware of the stranger, and yet no one challenged him. No one raised a musket. No one called the guards. It was as if something in his presence stilled their hands. He began to walk through the camp, his steps soft, his pace calm, while all around him men stared in silence. His boots made no sound on the dirt, though his coat moved with the breeze. His Bible pressed close to his chest. He passed wounded men who lifted their heads at his approach, and for a moment their pain seemed lighter. One soldier, bleeding from his shoulder, swore. He felt warmth rush through him like a prayer, answered. Another whispered that when the man looked into his eyes, he felt both exposed and comforted. The stranger reached the center of camp, where the largest fire burned. Men sat around it, their faces tired, their hearts heavy with fear. He stopped there and raised the Bible slowly. His voice came low, at first quiet enough that only the nearest men heard, but then it grew deeper, fuller, echoing across the camp as though the air itself carried his words. He did not shout, and yet every man could hear him. His voice seemed to bypass distance to slip past the noise of the night and lodge itself directly in their minds. He spoke not of armies or nations, not of north or south, but of life and death, of fear and courage, of the souls of men standing at the edge of eternity. He told them that war was a furnace, and that in the fire of suffering their true selves were revealed. He said that no bullet could destroy the spirit if the spirit clung to faith. He said the land was soaked with blood, but the heavens still open to those who did not surrender their hope. His words cut deeper than any sermon the soldiers had ever known, for he spoke as if he had seen the grave and walked back from it. The men listened, some with tears sliding down their faces, others gripping their rifles tighter, as though holding on to life itself. They had heard preachers before, camp chaplains who gave words of courage and hope. But this was different. There was weight in his words, a kind of knowing that no ordinary man could carry. When he paused, silence swept over the camp. No cough, no whisper, only the crackle of fire and the thrum of his voice lingering in the air like smoke refusing to fade. One soldier swore. He saw a faint light behind the preacher as he spoke. Another said he felt a hand rest on his shoulder, though no one stood there. A few whispered in fear, believing the man to be no mortal preacher at all, but a spirit sent by God, or perhaps by something darker. Yet none left their place, none turned away. They could not. His presence held them captive, not by force but by awe. When he finished his sermon, he did not linger. He closed the Bible slowly, as if placing something sacred to rest. Then he lowered his head in silence. He did not ask for food. He did not ask for shelter. He did not even look for thanks. He simply turned and began to walk toward the edge of camp where the night waited to swallow him. Men rose to follow, but in the dim light of the fires he was already gone, as though the shadows themselves had claimed him. In the morning, soldiers searched for signs of him. They asked each other who had seen him arrive, who had seen him leave. No one could answer. There were no footprints in the dirt, no trail of travel, no sound of departure. The Bible he carried was gone with him, as if he had never been there at all. And yet every soldier could remember his words, etched into their minds, like scripture written in fire. They would never forget the phantom preacher who came in black, holding a Bible worn by time. But questions lingered. Was he truly a man, or something else entirely? Had war broken their minds, or had heaven sent them a messenger? Soldiers began to whisper. They began to spread the story from camp to camp, and in every telling the preacher grew more mysterious. Some said his face glowed in the firelight. Others claimed he bore scars like crucifixion marks on his hands. Some even swore his shadow did not move with his body. They called him the phantom preacher, and with each retelling his legend deepened. At first, the soldiers spoke of him in whispers, as if naming him too loudly might call him back. His words did not leave their minds. They clung to every phrase as though the sentences had been carved into the marrow of their bones. His sermons were unlike anything they had ever heard, for he did not speak like other preachers who used scripture as a weapon to rally men or soothe them with promises of heaven. Instead, he spoke as if he had walked ahead of them, seen what lay beyond, and returned only to tell what awaited. Became known quickly not only in the camp where he first appeared, but in camps across Virginia. And beyond, soldiers carried his words like contraband, passing them from one fire to another, from one regiment to the next. And the stories shifted with each retelling. Some men swore he predicted the exact hour of a skirmish, days before it came to pass. Others said he named the hills and valleys where men would fall long before the first cannon roared. They said he spoke of death and salvation, as if both were neighbors standing at the edge of camp, waiting for the calm, and began to say he knew the future, not in riddles or vague visions, but in clear, precise warnings. One company claimed he told them 3 names, the names of men who would not live to see the next dawn when the morning came. Those 3 names were carved into wooden crosses, hurriedly planted in the dirt. Another group told of how he warned them not to march on a certain road, saying it was a road paved with grief. Their commander ignored the warning and led them on that path by nightfall. Half the company lay silent in the mud. His reputation grew, and with it fear, for though some clung to him as a prophet, others began to whisper that he was cursed, that he carried death in his voice, that to hear him was to invite the grave into your tent. One soldier said that when the phantom preacher spoke of salvation, he could feel both heaven and hell listening, hanging on every word, waiting to claim souls, as if the preacher himself stood balanced between both realms, not belonging to either in the north and the south alike. The legend traveled. Officers dismissed the stories as superstition, yet even they listened when his name was mentioned, for, in war, even the proud and the powerful crave certainty, and the phantom preacher seemed to carry certainty like a torch in the darkness. Common men told his tales in hushed tones. While writing letters, home mothers and wives heard rumors of him and prayed that if he was real, he might find their sons and speak hope into their hearts before death found them. What unsettled the men most was not only his words, but his presence. There was a weight to him that made silence fall wherever he walked. He carried no weapon yet. Soldiers swore he was more fearsome than any general. His eyes saw too much. His voice carried too far, and when he spoke of salvation, he did not smile. He did not weep. He delivered the promise of heaven with the same tone that he delivered the certainty of death, as if both were equal, as if he had no power to change either, only to reveal what was already written. Some nights after his visit, men would wake screaming from dreams in which they heard his voice calling their names sometimes. Those same men would fall the next day. Sometimes they would live and carry the terror of that dream for the rest of their days. Whether he was truly predicting or simply planting fear, no one could say. But the line between faith and dread blurred, until men could not tell if he was angel or omen. The strangest part was that no 2 men remembered his sermons exactly the same. One soldier swore the preacher spoke of rivers of blood. Another claimed he heard words of peace and comfort. Still another said the man promised reunion with family after the war. How could one sermon hold such different truths unless the words were shaped for each man alone, as if the phantom preacher looked into their souls and spoke what only they needed to hear? This became the heart of his mystery, for how could he speak to so many, yet feel so personal? Soon stories claimed that even the dying called for him. Men bleeding out on the battlefield whispered, "Preacher, preacher," as if expecting him to appear in the smoke and kneel beside them. Some said he did appear at times, only to those whose eyes were closing forever. They swore he placed his hand upon their chest and whispered one final word before they slipped into the silence of death. Others dismissed these tales as fever dreams, but the stories spread like fire through dry grass, and belief grew stronger than doubt. The phantom preacher became a shadow looming over the war itself, his legend as real to the soldiers as the generals who commanded them. He needed no army, no banner, no nation. His sermons marched faster than any regiment. His voice carried further than any cannon. Men swore that when he spoke, it was not the sound of a man but the echo of eternity itself. And so he became known, not just as a preacher, not just as a stranger in black, but as something beyond human, a figure tied to fate, a messenger who walked the border between life and death. His words carried the weight of prophecy. His silence carried the weight of dread. To meet him was to feel the pull of both salvation and the grave, and every soldier who spoke his name wondered quietly in the dark whether the phantom preacher had already spoken their fate. The stories began in whispers, traveling from cot to cot across smoky camps where wounded men lay broken and bleeding, their bodies shattered by lead and steel, their spirits nearly extinguished. Yet when the phantom preacher appeared among them, something stirred men who had lost the will to breathe. found themselves inhaling deeply as though his very presence filled their lungs. One soldier with a shattered leg swore that after hearing the preacher speak, he no longer felt pain, only a strange calm that allowed him to smile as he drifted into sleep. Others said that his words wrapped around them like a blanket, warm and heavy enough to chase away the cold grip of despair. Soon tales grew larger. Men said they saw comrades rise from the edge of death standing straighter than they had in months. Some limped forward, clutching wounds that should have ended their lives, but walking as though burden had been lifted. One officer recounted that the preacher spoke to a boy whose chest was soaked with blood. The boy opened his eyes for the first time in days, whispered a prayer with the preacher, and then managed to speak farewell before passing with peace instead of terror. It was said the preacher gave them not life but dignity, the strength to face whatever came without fear. But there were others who swore the power went further. One claimed a soldier too weak to move sat up after the sermon, his face pale but his eyes burning with light. Another said that a man with fever so high the surgeons had abandoned him walked into the night after the preacher touched his shoulder. Skeptics argued that it was madness, that desperation twisted memories into miracles. Yet the stories multiplied until no one could ignore them. And there was something else, something far stranger. Soldiers said that even when the preacher stood silent, his voice continued to echo through the camp. Men swore they heard his words carried on the wind long after his lips had closed, sometimes in the still hours of night when the fires burned low and the camp was hushed, save for the groans of the injured. They would hear it, a faint sermon drifting through the tents like smoke, reminding them of hope and judgment, of life and death. It was not a sound that came from ears alone. It was a sound that pressed into the bones. Many grew fearful, wondering if he had truly spoken at all, or if the words lived within them now like a haunting presence. One soldier swore he awoke to hear the preacher whispering his name, yet when he opened his eyes, no one stood beside him. Others claimed they heard the echo of prayers when the wind rushed through the torn canvas of their tents. Skeptics insisted these were only tricks of a mind frayed by war, but believers declared it was proof that the phantom preacher was no mere man. For no mortal voice could linger so long after silence. Officers began recording testimonies in letters home, some written with awe, others with dread. They described men whose spirits had risen, not from medicine or rations, but from words alone. They described nights where even the dying smiled content, as though their fate had already been spoken with certainty by a voice beyond human reach. And they described the eerie moments when silence itself seemed alive, vibrating with the memory of that sermon in time. The accounts began to clash. Some men claimed the voice was gentle, comforting, like the voice of a father guiding his children. Others swore it was sharp, like thunder, shaking them awake and forcing them to see their sins. How could both be true unless the voice was not one sound but many? Unless each man heard what his soul demanded most. The thought unsettled them deeply, for it meant the preacher spoke not with one tongue, but with countless, and no one could escape the message crafted for him alone. The legend of the phantom preacher deepened with each retelling. Some said he healed the spirit. Others insisted he healed the body. Some feared his voice would never leave them, that it would echo in their heads until the grave, while others prayed each night to hear it again, begging for that impossible comfort. No matter the division, all agreed on one thing: his presence could not be denied, and his absence felt heavier than the war itself. And so across Virginia and beyond, men remembered the phantom preacher not as a man but as a force, a presence that slipped between silence and sound, leaving them uncertain whether they had witnessed miracle or madness, yet longing for one more chance to hear the echo that haunted the night. The rumors spread like fire through dry fields, carried on the tongues of men who had seen too much and believed too easily. They began with quiet voices around the campfires, one soldier asking another, What do you think he was? Was he flesh and blood like us, or something far older than the war itself? Soon the whispers traveled beyond the camps, carried to nearby towns, spoken in taverns and churches, until the entire countryside seemed to hum with the same question. Was the phantom preacher a man of God or a spirit sent to guide the dying? For some the answer was simple. They swore he was a messenger from heaven, an angel in the shape of a weary pastor who had come to lead broken souls across the final threshold. They pointed to the calm that fell whenever he spoke to the wounded, to the way dying men faced the grave with smiles after hearing his words. They said no human voice could bring such peace, that no ordinary man could walk into a camp without footsteps and leave without trace. But others whispered darker tales. They feared he was not a messenger of salvation, but a herald of death itself, a shadow cloaked in scripture, a figure who came not to comfort but to warn that their end was near. Men swore that whenever he appeared, death followed close behind. Sometimes a battle, sometimes disease, sometimes a skirmish that left the soil red with blood. To them, the phantom preacher was no savior. He was an omen, a black flag walking among them. In the silence between battles, these rumors grew stronger. Men could not decide which was worse, to be blessed by his presence or cursed by it. Some admitted they longed to see him again, craving the certainty of his voice, even if it spoke only of death. Others confessed they prayed never to glimpse his shadow, fearing that his arrival meant their days were numbered. His very name carried weight when spoken. It silenced laughter. It stilled hands. It chilled the air. Townsfolk, too, took up the legend. Widows, mourning lost husbands, claimed the phantom preacher must have visited them in their final moments, guiding them gently away from the agony. Mothers, weeping for sons, declared that no mere man could walk the battlefields. Unnoticed, they insisted he was a spirit roaming between the living and the dead. His sermons meant not for the ears, but for the souls of those about to cross over. Yet there were skeptics who said the stories were madness, born of fear. They argued that war breeds visions, that men so close to death see angels or demons in every shadow, that the phantom preacher was nothing more than a tale told to soothe trembling hearts. Still, even they admitted uneasily that too many accounts existed, too many voices speaking the same. Name too many men swearing they had heard the same echo when no echo should have lingered. In one camp, a chaplain wrote in his journal that he feared the preacher more than the cannons, for cannons killed the body, but the phantom preacher threatened the soul. If he was truly of God, the chaplain wrote, then why did his sermons fill men with dread as often as with peace? Why did his voice sound like thunder rolling from a grave? Why did men who claimed to see him often die soon after? These questions haunted him until he too wondered if the preacher was sent not by heaven but by something else, something that thrived on wars. Months passed, the debate only deepened. The phantom preacher became more than a story. He became a symbol, to some, a sign that God had not abandoned the broken nation. To others, a reminder that death could not be outrun. His name traveled faster than letters, faster than orders, spreading across north and south alike. The enemy lines held no power over his legend, for death does not choose sides, and neither did the phantom preacher. Soldiers carried the rumors like curses or blessings in their pockets. Some clutched them for hope, others spat them out in rage, but none could escape the shadow of the question: was he a man of God or a spirit sent to guide the dying? Or was he something darker, a harbinger of death cloaked in the guise of a holy man? And in the quiet hours of night, when the battlefield slept and the stars hid behind clouds, each man wondered, alone in his heart, whether the phantom preacher was already watching, whether his name had already been spoken in that echoing voice that no silence could erase. The storm that night rolled over Virginia like a living beast. The sky tore itself open with jagged light, and the earth shook with the sound of thunder. Rain poured across the camp, soaking tents and drowning the fires that soldiers had built for warmth. The men huddled together, their uniforms clinging to their skin, their eyes wide with fear, for they knew the storm was not only in the sky, the enemy waited beyond the trees, and every man could feel death pressing close. Then he came, the phantom preacher, his black coat heavy with rain, his Bible clutched against his chest, as if even the storm could not tear it away. Some swore he appeared from the lightning itself. One moment the camp was dark, the next, the flash revealed him standing in the center. His eyes shadowed his presence, impossible to ignore. The men turned toward him, drawn as though the thunder carried his command. He lifted the Bible slowly, the rain striking its worn leather cover, and opened it. Though the pages should have dissolved under the water, they did not. They seemed to glow faintly, even in the darkness. He raised his voice, and though the storm raged, his words cut through it. Not louder, not harsher, but sharper. Every man heard every word, as if whispered directly into his ear. He spoke of sin and salvation, of the fragile line between life and death. He told them that the earth itself cried out, with the blood spilled upon it, that the storm above was not sky, but judgment, rolling down upon a nation torn apart. He spoke of mercy offered only once, of doors closing forever, of choices that could not be unmade. His words were not gentle, they were heavy, each syllable a stone pressed onto the hearts of the men who listened. Soldiers who had faced musket fire without trembling now wept openly, their faces streaked with rain and tears. Alike some fell to their knees in the mud, clutching their rifles like crosses. Others pressed hands to their faces, muttering prayers long forgotten. They believed with all their being that this was their final chance to repent, that the phantom preacher had come not as comfort, but as warning. Lightning split the sky again, and in that moment his shadow stretched across the camp longer than any man should cast. Some swore the shadow twisted into shapes not human. Some claimed they saw wings. Some said horns. Others dared not look at all for fear of what they might see. And yet no one turned away from his voice. It held them captive. It pulled at the deepest corners of their souls. One soldier cried out that he saw his dead brother standing beside the preacher. Another swore he heard his mother's voice mingling with the sermon, as though the phantom carried the voices of the departed within him. The camp seemed to shift between worlds that night, half in the mud of Virginia, half in the realm of spirits, the boundary between life and death, trembling under the weight of his words. When he spoke of repentance, his voice deepened until it seemed the thunder itself answered him. When he spoke of forgiveness, the rain lessened for a moment, as if the heavens themselves paused to listen. When he warned that not all would see the next dawn, a sudden wind swept through the camp, extinguishing what little fire remained, leaving only the preacher's voice and the flashing light of the storm. Men confessed sins aloud, shouting over the thunder as if desperate to be heard by heaven and by the phantom preacher alike. Others simply bowed their heads, their tears mingling with the rain, afraid to speak, afraid that words might seal their fate. The camp became a cathedral, not of wood and stone, but of mud and fire and storm and death. Each soldier a penitent, each soldier trembling beneath the weight of eternity. As the sermon reached its end, the storm raged harder. The preacher lifted his Bible one last time, and his voice carried across the night. He told them that dawn would bring fire and blood, that some would fall and some would rise, that every soul was already written in the book he held, though no man could see the pages then. He closed the Bible, gently pressed it to his chest, and lowered his head. Silence followed for a moment. Even the thunder seemed to wait. The rain slowed, the air hung heavy. No one dared breathe. Then lightning struck again, and where the flash had illuminated him, he was gone, no footsteps, no trace. The space where he had stood now empty. The men stared into the storm, certain they would never see him again. certain they had just witnessed the final warning before the end. So they wept not because of the storm, not because of the battle that awaited, but because the phantom preacher had told them their last chance was passing, and deep within their hearts they believed him. The dawn crept slowly over the battlefield, the sky bruised with the color of smoke and ash. The storm had passed, leaving behind the smell of wet earth and the silence that follows thunder. The soldiers stirred in their tents, their bodies stiff, their eyes hollow from the night before. Many had not slept at all. They had sat awake trembling with the weight of his words, praying, whispering, clutching tokens of faith, waiting for something, waiting for dawn to show them whether hope or despair had taken root. When the first light reached the camp, the men looked to the center where the preacher had stood his pulpit. Nothing more than a crate of splintered wood now stood bare. The rain had washed it clean. The mud beneath held no prints, no mark of boots, no trail of a man who might have walked away. Upon the pulpit lay only the Bible. The same Bible they had seen cradled in his hands, the same cracked leather, the same worn edges. Yet now it rested open, the pages fluttering faintly in the wind. Though the air itself felt heavy and still, men approached cautiously, some with rifles clutched tight, others with heads bowed. None dared touch the book. At first it seemed wrong to place mortal hands upon it, for it did not look like any ordinary Bible. It seemed older than the war, older than the nation itself. Some swore the letters shimmered faintly upon the pages, though the light was thin and gray. One soldier bent to read and whispered that the words upon the open page spoke directly to him, though another claimed the same words read differently to his own eyes. The preacher was gone. No one had seen him leave. No footsteps led from the pulpit to the trees. The mud held the prints of soldiers, of wagons, of horses, but nowhere the mark of his boots, as though the rain itself had refused to record his passage. Some swore he had been taken into the storm, carried off in lightning and thunder. Others believed he had walked into the mist between worlds and chosen not to return to theirs. Fear spread through the camp, though not the fear of battle. This was a deeper fear, a fear that gnawed at the soul. Men argued among themselves. One insisted he had seen the preacher slip into the shadows at dawn. Another swore he had kept watch all night and that the man had never moved at all. Some claimed they heard his voice lingering still, soft and low, like a prayer carried in the wind. Others swore they saw his silhouette at the tree line, only to find nothing when they blinked. Officers tried to calm the men, but their own hands shook as they turned the pages of the Bible. One captain said the book was nothing more than leather and paper, yet even he would not take it from the pulpit. It lay there as though waiting, but waiting for what no one knew. As the sun climbed higher, the silence deepened. The camp seemed hollow without the weight of his presence. The soldiers felt abandoned. Some muttered that his disappearance meant they were forsaken, that the sermon had been not a promise, but a warning. Others argued that he had done what he was sent to do, that his words had been enough, that they should carry them now into battle, whether or not he returned. But in every heart, questions burned. Why had he come? Why had he vanished? Why had no man seen him leave? And why did the sight of that Bible left behind fill them with more dread than comfort? The legend took root at dawn. That day the phantom preacher who appeared from nowhere spoke one final sermon and vanished without a trace. The empty pulpit, the open Bible, the absence of footprints, these became the proof soldiers carried with them, proof that he had never been a man at all. Or if he was, he had walked into mystery too deep for them to follow. And so the camp prepared for battle under a silence heavier than cannon smoke, carrying within it the memory of a man who had stood among them and then left them with nothing but words. Within days the regiment was thrown into the furnace of battle. The calm of the storm-torn night was shattered by the roar of cannons and the crack of muskets. The fields that only yesterday held silence and damp grass were now drowned in smoke and fire. The air burned with the scent of powder and blood. Men who had sat beneath the phantom preacher's sermon found themselves face to face with death, their hearts pounding, their ears ringing, their minds returning again and again to the words they had heard beneath the storm. The battle tore through them like a tide, merciless, and unending. Men fell in droves, cut down where they stood. The cries of the wounded mingled with the clash of steel. The mud grew thick with blood until the ground itself seemed alive. Groaning under the weight of so many bodies, the regiment, once strong and proud, was broken, reduced to fragments within hours. Friends carried friends only to collapse beside them. Letters clutched in trembling hands were lost to the wind. The songs of faith that once rose in the camp were drowned in screams and silence. Those who survived crawled from the wreckage, their eyes vacant, their faces hollow. They spoke not of glory, nor of victory. They spoke only of the phantom preacher. His words rang in their ears louder than the battle itself. Men swore he had told them this would come. They remembered the weight in his voice, the certainty with which he had spoken. That dawn would bring fire and blood, that not all would rise again now. As they looked upon the shattered remnants of their regiment, they knew his warning had not been a metaphor. It had been truth, carved into their fates. Some wept openly, not for themselves, but for the preacher's prophecy, fulfilled, for the proof that he had seen further than any man should see. One survivor claimed he remembered the preacher's eyes that night, eyes that seemed to look beyond the flesh into the soul. And he realized too late that those eyes had already counted the dead. Before the first shot had been fired, another swore that when the cannons began their thunder, he heard the echo of the preacher's sermon louder than the guns, as if the battle itself was only a shadow of the storm. That voice had unleashed. The losses were devastating. Men who had fought side by side for years were gone. In moments, names once spoken in laughter, now carved hurriedly into crude wooden markers. The survivors dug shallow graves with trembling hands, praying the ground would hold the weight of so much sorrow. They spoke over the dead, but their words faltered. For all they could remember were the preacher's warnings. No prayer seemed strong enough. No hymn seemed worthy enough. His sermon had already spoken the final rites before the battle had begun. Rumors spread among the survivors that the preacher had chosen the regiment specifically that he had come to deliver his warning because he knew their fate was sealed. Some whispered that his appearance had not been mercy, but judgment, that his words had not been to save them, but to prepare them for the end. Others insisted the opposite, that without his sermon many would have died without peace, that he had been sent to ease their passing, to guide their souls across the river, they argued, but none could dismiss the truth. His words had matched their fate. As survivors limped from the battlefield, they carried the story with them, spreading it to other camps, to villages, to families waiting at home. They told of the preacher who had appeared in black beneath the storm, who had spoken of death with certainty and of salvation with equal weight. They told of how within days the regiment was destroyed. Just as he had said, the legend grew larger with every telling, for each man who heard it added his own fear, his own awe, his own need to believe that something beyond human had walked among them. For those who had survived, the preacher became more than memory. He became a presence haunting them in every quiet moment when they closed their eyes. They heard his voice when they tried to sleep. They dreamed of his shadow when they prayed. They wondered if he was listening instead of God. Some confessed that they felt cursed to have heard him. Others felt blessed to have been warned. But all carried the same certainty that his words were no accident, that he had known what was to come, and that his warning was not for the regiment alone, but for anyone who still breathed in that torn and bleeding land. And so the survivors swore his words had been a warning, a final gift, a final curse, depending on the heart of the man who received them. His sermon became their anchor and their torment. their burden and their faith. The battle had taken their brothers, but it had left them with a legend that no musket ball, no cannon shot could erase. The phantom preacher had spoken, and the war had answered exactly as he said. Years passed, the war ended, but its scars clung to the land, and to the men who had survived, the memory of the phantom preacher did not fade. It grew like ivy winding through their minds, haunting their nights, shaping. Their faith veterans who had once stood beneath his sermon swore they still felt his presence. Some claimed they saw him near abandoned churches, weathered wood sagging under the weight of years, windows shattered, doors hanging loose in the wind. They said he stood in the doorway, a black figure still holding that worn Bible, his face half lost to shadow, his eyes reflecting no light. Some tried to approach, but each step carried them no closer until the vision vanished like smoke. Others whispered of nights when the wind carried his voice across the fields. It came low and steady, sometimes no more than a murmur, other times sharp and ringing as if carried by the echoes of cannons. Men on their deathbeds said they heard him calling their names, not in cruelty, but in certainty, as if he had waited for them to return to him. One veteran near the end of his life swore he woke to find the preacher seated beside him, silent, only watching when the old soldier reached for his hand. The vision faded, yet the air stayed colder until his final breath. Families told stories of their fathers and brothers waking in the night drenched in sweat, convinced they had just heard the preacher's sermon again. Every word exactly as it had been that stormy night in 1863. Some believed the preacher had become a spirit bound to the souls of those he had warned, cursed to walk with them until they were all laid to rest. Others said he was an angel, not of light but of solemn duty, carrying the message of mortality wherever it was most needed, guiding men toward their last moment of repentance. In small towns across Virginia, whispers clung to the air church bells that rang, though no hand pulled the rope candles that flickered to life in chapels. Long abandoned travelers told of hearing footsteps on broken wooden floors when no one stood near. Some said the preacher was seen wandering graveyards, pausing at the stones of soldiers whose names had been lost to history, kneeling in silence before fading inscriptions, then vanishing before anyone dared to speak. The veterans who carried his memory grew old, yet his presence never aged. He was always the same, a tall, dark figure draped in black, the Bible worn but unbroken, his voice never louder than a storm, never softer than a whisper in the leaves. Each man who told his story swore that hearing him was not a dream, but a visitation. They spoke of the weight in their chest, the cold in their bones, the unshakable certainty that he had never truly left. With every telling, the legend grew. Some believed he appeared only to those near death, a final messenger walking between this world and the next. Others said he came when war threatened again, when the land trembled with unrest, his shadow returning to remind men that the cost of blood was never forgotten. Mothers warned their children of wandering too close to abandoned churches lest they hear the voice of the phantom preacher calling from within. For some, his presence was terror, for others comfort, but for all, it was undeniable. The preacher who had vanished from the battlefield still walked the land unseen and unheard until the moment he chose to reveal himself, his warning echoing in the wind, his shadow etched in memory, his legend refusing to fade. To this day, the debate still lingers across dusty libraries, quiet lecture halls, and fireside gatherings where old stories refuse to die. Historians pore over faded letters, brittle diaries, and scattered reports, searching for evidence of the phantom preacher. Some argue he was nothing more than a wandering pastor, a man broken by the war who found himself in the middle of a camp and spoke words shaped by the chaos of the age. They insist his disappearance was no mystery but a simple truth that in a world of marching armies and burning towns, men could vanish without trace taken by disease, conscription, or the cruel hand of fate. Yet others shake their heads and lean closer to the fire, their voices low as though the preacher himself might be listening. They remind us that too many accounts speak the same details: the black coat, the worn Bible, the voice that echoed even when his lips stilled. They remind us of the survivors who swore they saw him years later outside shattered churches and in graveyards where no living soul should have been. They argue that legends this strong do not rise from nothing, that the phantom preacher was never flesh alone, but something beyond human, something that belonged to the blood-soaked soil of 1863. The question divides scholars and believers alike. Was he simply a man of God, caught in the whirlwind of war? Or was he a spirit bound to the cries of the dying, destined to return when the wind turned cold and the earth remembered the weight of death? Skeptics point to the chaos of battle, to the human need for comfort and meaning, to the way grief shapes memory and memory shapes legend. They claim the preacher was born not from truth, but from desperation, a symbol soldiers created to carry their fears and their faith. But the veterans who lived through it spoke differently. They did not describe a tale woven from sorrow, but a presence heavy and real as smoke on the battlefield. They spoke of his eyes, seeing beyond the veil of the present, into futures already carved in stone. They spoke of his voice, not as comfort alone, but as judgment. A voice that followed them long after muskets had fallen silent and the war was ash behind them. They held firm until their dying breaths that what they had seen was no ordinary man. And so the mystery endures, whispered in classrooms, told again at memorials, carried in books and in sermons where faith and folklore blur some nights when the storm gathers and the air is thick with the scent of rain. Wanderers swear they hear a voice in the distance, steady and relentless as if preaching to the darkness itself. Those who know the legend fall silent, for they remember the tale of the phantom preacher who appeared in black beneath a raging sky and vanished, leaving only questions behind to this day. The debate burns. Was he a man lost to war, or was he the phantom preacher? Forever tied to the broken land, the torn soldiers, and the eternal grief of 1863. No answer has ever silenced the question, and perhaps none ever will. For some truths are not meant to be solved, they are meant to be carried, whispered, remembered, like the echo of a sermon that refuses to fade.